In today's tutorial, we're going to be animating water in a pixel art style. We're going to be using frame-by-frame animation, some Photoshop animation, as well as some path animation within After Effects. I'll only be using one third-party plugin called TimeLord, which is paid. However, all the free sort of alternatives are down below. So, if that's of interest to you, let's jump into the tutorial and see how it's done. So, to start animating in Photoshop, as you see here, we're going to want to create a new file. I got some presets for pixel art specific stuff. So here you can see I've got 120 by 150. Let's just make that square format. So it's 150 pixels by 150 pixels. Here you can change it, make sure you're in pixels. Leave the resolution on 72 pixels per inch, as you can see here. And leave all the other settings as there is, unless you know how to mess around with them and if they're specific to your project. But if that's not of relevance to you, just go and press create and now you've got your new document. So pressing Command 0, we can zoom in and sort of see what sort of stuff we're going to be working with. Obviously, you don't see a pixel grid yet. If you press Command and the quotation marks, you can see the actual pixel grid. We can zoom in on that. There are some extra settings for creating a pixel grid specifically like this, but I will link down to a video below that sort of explains it in way more detail than we're going to be going into here. So to actually start drawing in pixel art, you're going to want to select the pencil tool and make sure your actual size of pencil is really low, like less than 100 basically, because otherwise, you're just not going to get the actual pixel feel. Obviously, there is a lot around sort of pixel aspect ratios and pixel sizing, but that's beyond the sort of scope of this video. Today, we're just sort of focusing on how to actually draw water in pixel art. So in that sort of note, we're going to be talking a little bit about how to actually use animation in Photoshop. We're going to go over the basics here, but again, video descriptions will have sort of other videos that will teach you in more depth. So what I'll show you here is basically how to use TimeLord, which is very similar to a free alternative called AnimDessin. So there's, again, in the descriptions, all the information for that. Just follow those tutorials there and come back to this video once you sort of set that up. Alternatively, you can use Aseprite or Pixel Edit or any other pixel animation software. Will work the same way, but this is just how you do it on Photoshop. So essentially on Photoshop, what you want to do is create a video timeline layer, as you can see here. All the layers, all the videos here. Pretty much the same as After Effects if you use After Effects mainly just After Effects. Animate works a little bit differently. First thing we're going to want to do is create a new timeline layer, which essentially makes sure that you're creating an animation. So whereas before, this layer 1 that you see highlighted, that's just one long frame. Whereas if you create a new timeline layer, you get these little, let me zoom in, these little frames. So if you press add frame here, you get all these little frames. But the first thing we want to make sure is that our frame rate is on 24. As all our animations that we're going to be doing, our hand drawn, are going to be 24 FPS, just because it reduces the amount of frames that we have to do. And it just makes it a lot easier to animate and a little bit quicker. So first thing we want to do is learn a little bit about ones and twos. In animations, you either draw one frame like every sort of 24th of a second, or you draw 2 frames every 12th of a second. So essentially, if you're going to be doing an animation that's 24 frames, so this is 24 frames here, you're going to want to do this 24 times basically, and that's how you animate in ones. Obviously, I'm not going to count that, but you can see this is animating in ones. So if we quickly design a little something here, say this little ball, and we move on to the next one. One main thing here, you're going to want to toggle on onion skin, as it'll allow you to see where your previous thing has been. And basically you can just do this. Wait, let me just change my size. There you go. Oh yeah, to change size of your actual brush, remember to press open and close square brackets. So yeah, basically we just do this really quickly. Just sort of move the ball about. Obviously we're not going to get too much into easing yet. This is just to show you the basics of it. But essentially once you sort of got that, you can then press play and boom. You got an animated ball. Now, if you're going to be animating in twos, which is what normally is recommended, you basically do half the work for about the same amount of animation. And it looks pretty similar. Obviously, it's a little bit slower, but then that way there are some techniques around that. But obviously, we're only going to be covering the basics today. So that's the main thing that we're going to be covering in terms of Photoshop animation. So let's jump into After Effects, create our motion path, and then we'll come back onto Photoshop to sort of draw the actual pixel art. So hopping onto After Effects, we're going to want to create a new comp. These are the settings I've used for this one here, which is just 1080 by 1080. It can be any square format. It doesn't really matter too much because it's just a reference that we're going to be using it. Make sure, again, that you have 24 frames per second. Main thing is, doesn't matter what frame rate you use as long as it matches everything you're doing. Obviously, give it an appropriate title. Duration doesn't really matter. Background color, that doesn't really matter for the moment. So once you start with the new comp, you're going to want to create a new shape layer. So this is just the example I've made before. So this is the reference I used for, let me just trim this down. This is the example I used in my previous animation, as you saw in the example at the start. And this is only about two seconds long. Obviously, if you see these numbers here, just sort of command and click, and it'll display the alternative style, as it says there. So to create this, you're going to want to use the shape layer or the pen tool, which is the easiest one. Pen tool can be easily accessed here by pressing G. And, well, we want to make sure we're not selected with anything. With the pen tool, we're going to essentially want to sort of click. If you've used After Effects before and you know how to use a pen tool, there's not really much else to it. But if you haven't used it before, it's pretty much like in Illustrator, or if you even haven't used Illustrator before, essentially you just want to click and drag stuff around. And obviously to sort of move points whilst you're creating them, hold space whilst you're clicking. And you get that sort of movement that you want. Obviously once you sort of place it, you can then rechange them later. If you want to change an angle, you can hold Alt on the curve and it'll change it itself. Or you can even just hold Alt on the little thing and it'll change it from a curve to a more straight edge kind of thing. Now to try and copy this sort of motion curve when you actually make your own. So you want to sort of start with a little bit of a rising in the water. You want the water to sort of swoop around. Try and match as close as you can to a circle. And then same when it comes back. So once it sort of loops back around again, try and get your curves as closely as possible. Obviously for your shape layer, you can press here to like select your fill options. I've got one with no fill because we don't really want to fill. And I've set my stroke again with a stroke, 100% opacity. Stroke color doesn't really matter. And the sort of width doesn't really matter either. But it can help if you are just sort of trying to get that proper curve for everything. So use a lower stroke width and just sort of play around with trying to get the shape properly. So we can spend some time here. Obviously you guys can do a little bit more in depth and more suited to your needs, but essentially just sort of play around with the handles, try and get a perfect-ish kind of circle. Just going to get as close as I can here just to not spend too much time on this, as we can sort of rectify any of this later on. All right, so essentially that's what you want to do. So we sort of bump the stroke back to a decent width. I'm using 100 pixels here, but you can use whatever size you want. Obviously, label your layer properly. So before it's called Water Guide, there's going to be called Water Ref for water reference. First thing we're going to want to do is sort of change the actual taper of it. So on shape 1, which is the shape that we just created, if we go onto the stroke section and we go on the taper, we can change the sort of start length to 100%, which means it's just going to make sure that this whole length is tapered like in this way. Obviously, playing around with it, you can explore more with it. And start width, you can have it as 25, just so it sort of thickens up the front a little bit more. And the other thing you're going to do is change this to a round cap. Obviously, you can't see it at the moment, but here you can see it's done a little change. So we go back to butt cap, a round cap, boom, easy. Now, to actually start doing some animations on with this, we're going to want to go on the content section of our layer, go to add, and you don't see on the screen right now, but right at the bottom, there's something called trim paths. If you just look for trim paths, it'll add it right here as you see. With trim paths, let me just sort of, oh, wrong animation. Let me open it up here. All right. With trim paths, you can obviously, if you've never used trim paths before, it basically animates a path layer, which is essentially what we want to do. The main thing you want to start with is sort of playing around with, keyframe start and the end parameters first, and then use the offset later on to finish off the animation. So I'm just going to use basically what I've already written down here before, just as it sort of worked for what I was doing for this tutorial. But obviously for you guys, you can have more fun experimenting with it. So if we start with 0% on both of these, and when we get to around, say, like, what's the time here? 21 seconds or something like that, you can start moving this around a little bit. So as you can see, it sort of shoots upwards. Now, the thing you got to remember is if we animate the end all the way to 100%, we still get all this. We don't get this effect, which you can only get if you animate both the start and the end parameters in this sort of like simultaneous kind of effect. So if we delete these keyframes really quick, what we want to do first, if we want to get this over this first half, so basically just get your curved over the first half, and then once you've sort of gone past that first bit, start moving the start keyframe a little bit more. So, oh, that's not what we want. Set this down to 0. Ooh, and then move this a little bit further on. But yeah, so once it gets to that bit, you've already got that animation going along. Then obviously as you continue again, let me zoom out a little bit more. Okay, that's all. You're going to want to move the front of it, or the end of it in this case, the end keyframe, all the way to this next sort of loop. Essentially what you want to try and get is whenever there's a massive change in motion, so here you saw it rises up, it sort of peaks and slows down at the top, and then swoops back down again and then slows back up here again. Whenever there's these major sort of changes, that's when you want to put a keyframe essentially. So again, there'll be another keyframe when it sort of swoops back down here, and then the final keyframe when it just goes all the way out. So essentially it will look something like this, like whoop. Pretty simple. And then obviously animate the start keyframe to match the length that you want of it. So essentially it would look something like that. And then you move it along a little bit as well. Obviously you guys can animate it whatever way you want, but this is essentially what you want to do. And obviously for this last bit, you can just put the start to the end, or you can also use the offset value to essentially, wait, let me change that a little bit. You can use the offset value to just do that itself, basically, which is quite fun, but it's not really needed for this bit. Let's change that back to 0 and change this to 100. So that is a lot of keyframes we're going to need to clean up in a bit, but essentially that's the motion you want. So we're going to get quickly into easing, so some of the basics of it. On a Mac, the command is function F9 if you've got one of the newer ones, or just press F9. Or if you don't have it, I can't really remember any other keyframes for it, but essentially you can right click and sort of easy ease with the sort of keyframe assistant. So if you right click on a keyframe, at the bottom there's keyframe assistant, and it just sort of allows you to easy in or whatnot. Alternatively, you can use motion tools. Again, it is a paid plugin, but if you do have it, you know how useful it is and you can play around with the values there. So once you actually easy ease stuff, you can see the sort of change it has. There's also easy use with function F9 or F9. And it makes the animation a lot more dynamic. Obviously, then we can go into the actual speed graph. I think this one's in speed graph. Yeah, it's on speed graph, which obviously looks very scary and some people may not know it. But essentially what it does is it means the higher it is, that's how much speed is going through it. And when it's at these little like bottom bits, there's no speed. That's essentially how you can read it. So say for this time, if you double click and you press continuous lock or continuous lock outgoing to income, basically means instead of having this really annoying feature, it's all together and it's a lot easier to sort of mess around with. So say for this first time you want to do that. Wait, that's not very clear. Basically, it'll just sort of move how fast it goes from one bit to another. So I'm going to show you the example I did for this one here. It's a lot quicker, just sort of save some time. I'll sort of click all these. You can sort of see the speed that each bit goes in. So let me open up the other one. So you can see it starts as slow, peaks at the top, zooms all the way back down. I think it'll be better with this, the end bit. And then as it reaches again, you can see it's gone slower, peaks up again, slows down again. And basically it's just all peaks and troughs that you want to try and get. So try and design your one, because obviously your motion path may be quite different. Main tip is make sure that all your sort of peaks and troughs are happening at the right points where there is a major sort of speed change, as you can see. And that way you get sort of this anticipation before it comes out. And yeah, just creates a more dynamic composition. Now, for the actual pixel art look that we saw in the video, there is a really sort of easy way to do it within After Effects that gives you the sort of basis for what you want to do. The first one we're going to want to add is turbulent displacement. As you can see up here, let me maximize this a little bit. And basically the main settings you want to change is sort of making sure this is on turbulent, the amount, you can play around with the amount you want. Obviously I don't know what your liquid is, but this is just what I found best for this. I didn't animate anything else, it was just there to give it sort of a warped feel. Let me get out of the speed graph here. The next thing I added was the mosaic effect. And as we sort of spoken before in the fire animation, even if I go on full, you can see that these some anti-alias sort of pixels that we don't really want when we're animating. And then that's, again, 1/8, 1 by 1/8. Basically the comp size divided by 10 is essentially what you want on the pixel size. That way it's just easier to sort of make sure that everything's consistent. And then using levels, it sort of reduces the amount of anti-aliasing you see. So it just makes the animation a lot clearer in general. And with that, that's how you basically get animated water. But obviously to actually stylize it to however you want, you're going to want to import this into After Effects. Best way to do that I found is to sort of add to this to the render queue. And let me just delete these so it's a lot clearer. And within the render queue, you want to click on the lossless setting where it says output module. Make sure you render it as RGB plus alpha. And once you're done with that, everything should render out as a transparent background, as you can see on that. So this button here toggles transparency. Obviously save in the right place and just hit render, and that should be good to go. Oh, side note, do not render this as in media encoder. It has to be saved as a .mov, as that's the only file format that I'm aware of that can support transparent backgrounds using After Effects. So now we're on to the actual fun bit of the tutorial. Once you've sort of got your .mov transparent thingy, obviously in this case I left the background in, as it's a little bit easier, but for your one it shouldn't have it. You can see clearly that the animation that we just made is now on within After Effects. Now obviously to start making animation here, as we explained before, we want to make a new timeline, which we'll label water outline. And this is basically going to be covering this blue, but in a more stylized effect. So the best way to obviously start this is by lowering down the opacity so we can just about see the image. Obviously if it's a bit too hard still to see, just create a new layer, make sure it's aligned. Ooh, we want this to go below and just change the coloring to say this light blue here. There you go, now it's a little bit easier to see. So as we saw, all you want to do basically, and I'll just sort of speed run through this afterwards and show you some bits and bobs you need to find out afterwards, but essentially what you're going to need to do is find out where the frame starts. So in this case, this frame starts here. So you just want to, using either the same color or a different color, let's just choose this bright blue here. We want to color this in here, and then we see what the frame changes again. We add another frame. Ooh. Color it again, see if the frame goes again, add another one. And basically just repeat this process until you get everything. Obviously, I'm not going to show the whole process on here, as it did take me a while to sort of do it all, but I'll go through some pointers that you're going to need to do as you go through it. So, running ahead of time, as you can see, I've already got all this pre-made. Essentially, you're going to be doing, as I said before, you're going to be animating all the waters, and then now we're going to talk about the sort of shading and these sort of water trail effects that you see on the back. Obviously, you can see the difference between animating on 1s and 2s. This animation is on 2s, the one you see up here. As you can see, is the 10, 11, 12. That's on 2s. Whereas the animation below is on 1s, and you can see the difference in smoothness. Obviously, for this animation, for most, 1s do work quite well, so there's no need to worry about that. So if we hide this layer down here, and we mainly focus on what we've created so far, what you'll see with a lot of these sort of effects is that I've got some sort of lighting somewhere. So say, for example, let me just create a new layer just not to mess up with the animation. And I messed up with the animation. So let's add it on top, get it back here. Let's choose, say, this yellow. This may look all right. So say we have a source of light up here. Say this is the sun. Ooh, sun. You can see all the lighting sort of reflects whereabouts the sun would be pointing at. Obviously this changes for like everyone's different approach, but this is essentially how I chose mine. I just chose a layer for light, and all my sort of highlights you can see with this lighter blue are all sort of in that sort of general direction. Obviously you could be more specific with it, but that's essentially it for lighting. One trick to make it look like actual water, if we sort of look at it in a little bit of a closer detail, you want to be quite fluid and sort of set your brush. So say we click on this one here, set your brush to sort of like a small, this is 4 or 5 pixels wide, and just sort of try and make the water feel as liquidy as possible. So say if we click on this layer, move that back down again. If we sort of color pick these 2 colors here, one trick or one technique that I use for this is I created the dark shades first. So this is a general lighting tip. You can either start with a light hue, so like this pale blue, and then work your way down. For this one, I found it a lot easier to go from darker shades to lighter shades. So if we do sort of color this in this darker blue first. All right, so if say we highlight this blue here, and then we select this here, and if we knew that our sort of lighting was all the way up here, with this selected using the magic wand tool, we can basically draw and it doesn't affect anything else, which is quite useful. And essentially you're gonna want to just create what essentially would look like water. Obviously you can use references for whatever style of water you're doing, but you wanna make sure that you have a bigger sort of like bit at the front to make it look like it's actually got a lot more reflection on it. And as you go down, you've got to reduce the amount of sort of light edges on it, as obviously this bit will be seen less. This is the main bit you want people to focus on, which is another thing for lighting. Obviously the thing that has more light, people will focus on more. So that's the main thing you should be drawing more of. So, you know, when it comes to the actual adding the highlights, you can even add just little bits of highlight here and there, just sort of go along with the edges of the water, and it sort of looks all right. Obviously, the way I sort of ended up finding that it worked best was just to sort of go on the edges and just do the same techniques to sort of add it using the size 4 pixel brush, and it worked a lot better. And essentially that's what you want to do. You just want to make sure that all your sort of lighting works and is consistent, and that it has some sort of like focus point at all times, so people can always follow the animation quite easily. Now, to get these really sort of crazy effects, obviously, as you can see, if I turn on the reference layer, that didn't have it. What I did is whenever I got a new frame of animation, let's say for this one, if I just sort of deselect that and I use, say, a red or different hue of blue, it was like this before, so just to sort of match what it was before. And essentially all I did is I sort of started like erasing it. So I erased bits and bobs that sort of I didn't want, added stuff back in again just to get this general look. And then using the toggling of the onion skin, I just sort of followed all the little bits that would be floating about. So in this case, we saw that it had this sort of shape. And as you go along the animation, the trail always follows. So if we go onto this one here, the trail always follows where the last one would be and starts disintegrating or moving about, following what the previous frame was doing. So this is probably the better example. So as you can see here, the trail is sort of starting to curves even more, still curving, and you can see a little bit of a wave. That's one of the main things, with, at least with this sort of water animation, that you're going to want it to curve, as that gives it a lot more of a fluid look. Just make it clearer there. So as you can see, it follows a sort of an S-shaped curve here, and it can sort of continues it a little bit, then it continues it here again. And here's where obviously where it gets a little bit more crazy, because it's just done a massive movement. And yeah, that's essentially how you get this water animation. Obviously, if you want to know anything in more detail, just let me know down in the comments. And if you've enjoyed this tutorial, check out some of my other tutorials on my YouTube, or head over to my Instagram, where I mainly like sort of post shorter reels or talk about all other things to do with freelance, animation, and pixel art. So if you've enjoyed, please do like and subscribe, and let me know your thoughts on what you want to learn next. Thanks for watching.